Hello. So, during this second period of lockdown, on a Sunday at 8 p.m, I will be reading a strange, sinister or spooky story. Now, for those of you in charge of smaller monsters, these stories won't contain any strong language or particularly graphic violence, but that doesn't stop them from being strange or spooky or disturbing. Just so you know. So tonight's story is by John Edgell, and it's simply called Bookworm. Mr. Purcell loved books. He adored them, and the older they were, the more he liked them. He revelled in the smooth feel of the old Morocco binding, the smell of crisp yellowy pages, the romantic old-fashioned print. His widowed sister Agatha, with whom he lived, nagged him for throwing away good money on books. But Mr. Purcell shrugged this off. Why should he forgo his one pleasure? He spent most of his spare time prowling around antiquarian bookshops, hunting for bargains, for prizes to add to the collection, which now burdened the shelves of his tiny room. His fiercest ambition was to obtain a copy of a book entitled The Burning of Beal, which had been published in 1702 by Thomas Purcell at Bow Yard in London. Mr. Purcell had seen this book in a footnote once and wondered whether Thomas Purcell might be one of his ancestors. He didn't know what was inside The Burning of Beal, but a strange voice whispered that he had to buy it. His inquiries amongst booksellers and agents revealed that only one copy was known to be in existence. It belonged to an antique dealer who owned a small shop in a courtyard near the Charing Cross Road. Every Tuesday, in the late afternoon, Mr. Purcell would walk down the courtyard, staring into the dusty bow window, trying to gather the courage to go in. But Mr. Purcell, who was a thin, stooped man, lacked courage. Strangely, he could never quite bring himself to enter the dark little shop. Every time he peered through the murky window, his heart started to throb. Perhaps the book was inside, bundled away in a basement. Perhaps it was locked in a safe in the back room. Mr. Purcell knew that until he dared ask the dealer outright, he would remain in this agitated condition. Mr. Purcell owned a chain of wine stores and earned a very comfortable living. He had hardly any interest in wine, being rather more concerned with the accounts and with whether a profit was being made each financial year. He could afford to pay any reasonable price for The Burning of Beal, but just the same, something always prevented him from passing through the dusty glass door and meeting the dealer face to face. Mr. Purcell visited the lonely courtyard many times. It was a shadowy Victorian yard, dirty and grubby, reminiscent of Dickensian London. Hardly a soul ever entered it. And in all that time Mr. Purcell had been visiting it, he'd never seen anyone step through the door. This, he thought, was peculiar. How could the dealer make a living if he had no customers? Mr. Purcell began to imagine that the dealer was a poor man and would be happy to part with the book. This thought renewed his courage, and he turned it over in his mind for several weeks. He felt that the time to meet the dealer was drawing near. And so, one foggy January afternoon, when the lamps were lit earlier than usual and the lights burned with a misty ochre, Mr. Purcell went to the courtyard and boldly entered the shop. An iron bell tinkled, and the door closed itself behind him. Looking quickly around, he saw that most of the stuff in the shop was worthless junk. Anxiously, he tapped his umbrella on the floor. After a moment, a brown curtain at the back parted and revealed a little bald man with glasses on the tip of his nose. He was very, very old and wore woolen gloves with the fingertips cut away. He breathed asthmatically, his breath hanging in puffs in the cold air. For a second, Mr. Purcell's courage failed. He wanted to turn and leave. He desperately wanted to ask about the book, but the words stuck in his throat. The dealer coughed and clutched his chest. "A cold day, a very cold day," he said. Mr. Purcell nodded. "Indeed. Can I do anything for you?" A moment paused. Mr. Purcell felt a sense of panic. Here was his opportunity to ask. "Go on," he told himself. "Ask now. Ask." "I'm inquiring about the book," he said nervously. The dealer seemed to hesitate. "A book? I don't have many books here, as you can see, no doubt." Mr. Purcell looked around. There wasn't a single book in sight. "A very special book," he said. He looked at the dealer. Was it the light, or had the little man turned pale? "A special book?" the dealer asked. Mr. Purcell looked around at the junk in the little shop. It really was unbelievably bad. He was silent a moment, and then whispered the book's title. "The Burning of Beale." The old man took off his spectacles and rubbed them on his sleeve. "I know of no such book." "My information is that you possess this book. Why do you deny it?" The old man repeated, "I know of no such book." Mr. Purcell wondered how long the pretense could go on. "My dear fellow, there's no sense in denying it. I know that you have the book. I want to know the price you're asking." The dealer's face was quite white. He sat down and pressed a handkerchief across his brow, his fat white hands trembling. Was it with anger or fear? He looked at Mr. Purcell and shook his head. "You don't know what you're asking." "It's very simple," Mr. Purcell said in a steady voice. "What is the price of the book?" "Please," said the dealer. "Go now. I'm prepared to forget you ever mentioned it." He took off his spectacles again and chewed the metal legs between his teeth. He looked around the shop, his bird-like eyes glittering, as if he were searching for a way out. "All right, why do you want the book?" "For my collection." "So, you collect books on the supernatural?" "No. I simply collect rare books." "You're not interested in the supernatural? Then this book isn't for you. Why buy a book that doesn't interest you?" Mr. Purcell grit his teeth. "Because I want the book. I think this publisher may have been an ancestor of mine. Thomas Purcell." "Thomas Purcell?" The dealer seemed very startled. He stood up, rubbing the palms of his hands on his trousers. He stared coldly at Mr. Purcell for a while. A silence fell. "I cannot sell you the book, because there's another buyer." "Another buyer?" Mr. Purcell smiled. "I'll offer more. How much is he offering for it?" He's not offering anything. He simply wants the book." "But that's absurd. I'm offering money." "Sell the book to me. I'll give you £100. Mr. Purcell began to feel reckless. His head was spinning as if he were drunk. The dealer walked up and down the shop. His head, which was shaking from side to side, reminded Mr. Purcell of the head of a sparrow picking at crusts. No, I cannot sell. I'm sorry. Please, go." Mr. Purcell said with a deadly calm. £100, man. That's a lot of money. For the first time, the dealer smiled. The other interested party isn't offering money. He isn't offering anything. I'd gladly sell you the book if I could. Then why don't you, for God's sake, man? I must have that book. The dealer sat down again, silhouetted in a chair near the window. Why do you think I keep a shop in this forsaken courtyard? Why do you imagine I live like this? Because I enjoy being a poor man? No, it's nothing like that. You must understand I am here because I have to be. Because here it's less easy for anyone to find me. Because the other interested party will have some trouble in seeking me out. Mr. Purcell hardly knew what to say in his exasperation. You afraid of this other person? If you are, why don't you sell the book to me? Then you'd have nothing more to fear. The dealer laughed bitterly. It would solve nothing if I sold you the book. I cannot sell it because it's not mine to sell. Mr. Purcell had no idea what he was talking about. Someone else wanted the book but was not offering money. So why didn't the old fool sell the book to Purcell? Clearly he was afraid of this other person, but why? And if the book didn't belong to him, then who owned it? Sell it to me, Mr. Purcell shouted, leaning forward, catching him by the wrist. Damn it, man, I want that book. The old man struggled feebly. Mr. Purcell glanced through the dirty window. Outside, the fog was thicker than ever. It was thick enough to hide anything. Anything at all. It was over in a flash. Mr. Purcell did not even remember doing it. The body of the old man lay on the floor, the neck broken from a sudden blow. In his hands, Mr. Purcell held a heavy bronze statuette of a soldier. As he looked down, the skin of the old man's face seemed to wither and grow strange. He might have been 200 years old. Quickly, he drew down the blind and put the close sign on the window. He hurried through the brown curtain into the back of the shop. As he'd imagined, a safe stood in the corner, and as luck would have it, a key lay on the top. He opened the steel door and rummaged through several sheets of paper before he found the book. It was wrapped in a cellophane envelope. Trembling, he removed it and thrust it inside his coat. On his way out, he hardly stopped to look at the old man's body, which now lay in a pool of darkening blood seeping from the mouth. The little iron bell rang again as Mr. Purcell left. He soon lost himself in the fog and covered a good distance from the shop. He found his way to the Strand Underground station and mixed with the noisy evening rush hour crowds. On his way home, he realised with surprise that he felt nothing at having killed the dealer. He'd never killed in his life before, and was astonished that it had been so easy. So very easy. In the privacy of his own study, Mr. Purcell took the book, The Burning of Beale, from the envelope and opened it carefully. The wonderful smell of old paper, damp with age, rose to his nostrils. This was the gem of his entire collection, a beautiful and rare book, his alone to cherish. And on the title page was scrawled in faded brown ink, first published by Thomas Purcell, 1702. He turned the pages and read here and there. Much of it was about those creatures that are neither living nor dead, the undead, half-shapes that come to stalk our nightmares. Mr. Purcell didn't believe a word of such superstitious nonsense, and wondered whether Thomas Purcell himself had believed it. On page 95, he suddenly saw a coloured drawing, which was so alive and horrible that he was riveted by it. From the yellow page, a man, or something like a man, stared at him, a hunched figure with red eyes, long dark hair, and a crippled leg. Mr. Purcell felt himself drawn against his will into those eyes and the reptilian loathing and malice that was contained within them. Sweating, he read the caption under the picture, which said, "Balthazar Beale, born in 1615, possessed of unnatural and unholy powers, a wicked and vile creature. In 1667, an attempt was made to burn him at the stake." Mr. Purcell closed the book and shut his eyes. What did it mean? An attempt had been made to burn him. Had he been burned or not? Had the flames gone out? Mr. Purcell replaced the book inside the envelope, locked it in the drawer of his desk, and then went downstairs to take supper with his sister, Agatha. For the next few weeks, Mr. Purcell examined every page of The Burning of Beale. It was a perfect specimen of its kind, in beautiful condition, its binding still immaculate. He was overjoyed with it, and it hardly mattered that the newspapers still clamoured about the brutal murder of the old man, whose name no one knew. Mr. Purcell felt safe. There was nothing to link him with the affair, and although a woman had claimed to have seen someone loitering near the courtyard a few times, this caused him no special anxiety. He ate and slept well, and the event began to fade from his mind. He even began to think he'd not committed the crime, and when his sister remarked that hanging was too good for the murderer, he found himself agreeing with her wholeheartedly. Mr. Purcell often went to the British Museum to explore the catalogues there. Only in the British Museum did he feel completely at home, in an atmosphere thick with reading and books. It was in the museum, in the reading room, that he had his first unpleasant experience. While examining a catalogue, he suddenly imagined someone staring at him. He looked around, but although he could see nothing, the odd feeling persisted. He went outside and walked through Bloomsbury, but he still had this strange sensation. He entered a public house, ordered a glass of brandy, and sat down at the corner of the saloon bar. In the mirror facing him, he suddenly saw, or thought he saw, the flash of a familiar face, but he couldn't be sure. When he looked again, there was nothing. At first he imagined the police might be on his trail, but this was a ridiculous thought. There was absolutely nothing to link him with the crime. He'd not left his umbrella behind, he'd worn gloves, so there were no fingerprints, and he'd locked the safe behind him. Unless the police knew about the book, they could not know that there'd been a robbery. After half an hour he hailed a taxi and went home. In the taxi he glanced several times through the rear window. What he was looking for, he didn't know. When he arrived home, his sister was in the drawing room reading a magazine. "Been to the museum, Rupert?" she asked. "Indeed," he answered. "By the way, someone called for you while you were out." "Oh yes? Anyone interesting?" "Didn't leave a name. I've never seen him before. Strange looking man." "Strange?" Mr. Purcell said as he poured himself a glass of brandy. "He said he'd come back. I don't know what he wanted." Mr. Purcell sat down and sighed. He hated visitors, unless it happened to be someone with an interesting book to sell. When he'd finished his drink, he went up to his study. The room was cold. He lit the fire, rubbed his hands, and took down The Burning of Beale. It was an amusing tale of witches, ghouls, ghosts and magicians, a lot of nonsense. And there was the drawing of Balthazar Beale himself, which reminded Mr. Purcell that he'd intended to check the name at the museum, to see if anything else was known. Mr. Purcell turned the pages. Suddenly, he again had the strange sensation that he was being watched. Something physical, malignant, seemed to threaten him from nearby. He stood up, looked quickly around the room, but found nothing out of place. He stared out of the window. Under the lamppost opposite, a man was standing. The collar of his coat turned up. He seemed to be staring up at Mr. Purcell, but perhaps this was an optical illusion. Mr. Purcell could not see the man's eyes properly, and he couldn't tell for sure. Just the same, he drew the curtain and returned to his book. But he couldn't concentrate now. He felt as if the air had been poisoned. He left the study and went down to talk to Agatha, but she'd gone out. It was late afternoon and the street lamps were already lit. Mr. Purcell drank another glass of brandy and wondered who could have called on him that afternoon. With a tingle of shock, he remembered that the dealer had said someone else was interested in obtaining the book. Could this other person now know that he had the book? No. How could that be? Could it have been this other person who'd called on him? Mr. Purcell felt strangely vulnerable. He must take things easy and relax. Possibly he was experiencing some reaction from the murder, an attack of nerves perhaps, a result of strain. He drank another brandy. It warmed his chest, but didn't relax him. He was about to pour another glass when the doorbell rang. Suddenly, he froze. Not a single muscle in his body moved. He held his breath. It shrilled again and again, and then at last he heard footsteps going away from the house. One foot dragging slightly, scraping against the concrete. Cautiously, Mr. Purcell peeped through the curtain. He saw the dim figure of a man go down the street. He drank some more brandy, and his head felt weary. After supper, he talked to Agatha for a time, and then, when she went to bed, he retired to his study. He decided to ignore the burning of Beale, and took out a paperback crime thriller, the perfect remedy for bad nerves, a good, short, relaxing read. It was a story of a badly bungled murder, with suspicions being thrown on all 6 guests in a country house. Halfway through, almost asleep, Mr. Purcell heard a noise on the stairs. It must be Agatha, he thought, going for a glass of water. Yet the noise seemed to come from just outside the door of his study. He sat up, now wide awake. To his horror, he saw the handle of the door being turned very slowly. His study seemed to grow very hot. "Who is it?" he called nervously. There was a long scraping sound, as if a fingernail had been drawn across the wood. Mr. Purcell felt as if a knife had been drawn across his flesh. He rose from the chair. The door was opening slowly. A white hand slid around its side. "Who is it?" Mr. Purcell picked up the poker, sweating in the rising heat. He stepped back. He raised the poker in anticipation. If it was a thief, he was ready for him. But Mr. Purcell had the feeling that it was something else. Slowly the door opened wide. The study felt like a furnace. Mr. Purcell felt the poker slip from his fingers and drop noisily onto the floor. There in the doorway stood a man. A familiar man. Or something like a man. Covered with charred flesh, the hunched figure stared with bloodshot eyes. Mr. Purcell gasped. The figure spoke. My name is Beale. Balthazar Beale. And I've come for my book. Dragging one leg behind, it inched towards him. I get the feeling that that book cost Mr. Purcell a lot more than the £100 he offered. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next Sunday. Stay safe.